Tasmania is an awesome place. We're known for our spectacular wilderness, fresh water and clean air. But we also punch above our weight when it comes to creativity, inventions and technology.
Tasmanian innovations, inventions and first. I think people will be staggered about the amount.
Historian Reg Watson wrote a paper titled Tasmanian Firsts, Inventions and Innovations. And I had the pleasure of seeing Reg talk about this subject, and I was just amazed with all the things that he'd found. So I have to share it with you. Strap in, it's going to be a big one.
Fact of the matter is, for our population in ratio to the rest of the nation, the amount of achievements we've had is absolutely enormous. And as I said, I think people will be staggered. And I think also we should be proud. And I'm not just talking of latter days. I'm talking from colonial times, that we've led the way. And some of these things, worldwide appreciation of what we've achieved, sometimes worldwide saving lives. And I can mention two of those aspects. So we should be appreciative of our ingenuity and our intelligence in Tasmania, and not put us... Our main enemy is our own selves. Well, let's get rid of that.
A chemist, Dr. David Warren, the son of the Reverend Hubert Warren, invented the black box, the recording instrument that contains all the information about an aircraft's flight.
That came from the very fact that his father went missing in a plane, and David decided to do something about it. The result was this incredible worldwide invention.
Hubert was lost in the crash of the Miss Hobart aircraft, travelling from Launceston to Melbourne in 1934. This drove David to invent the black box. Australia was the first country to make it compulsory for planes to carry the black box flight recorder in 1961. Although, as you can see, they're actually orange, which is the new black. Sadly, Tasmania can claim to be the home of one of the worst civilian aviation disasters in Australia's history, when on March 10, 1946, a DC-3 aircraft of the ANA fleet plunged into the waters off 7 Mile Beach, killing all 25 passengers and crew. The airline that's never had a fatal jet aircraft crash, Qantas, was started by a Launceston man, Hudson Fysh, who was a Gallipoli survivor and a combat pilot. We should honour Eric Waterworth, who invented the automatic method of changing a record on the gramophone. This revolutionised the enjoyment of recorded sound. Eric, now departed, said, "I was annoyed at having to get up and down all the time to change the record." Today we have the playlist to do that for us. An astronomer from Campbelltown, Alfred Barrett Biggs, built the first phone in Australia. Biggs was also headmaster of the local school and constructed 3 phones from Huon Pine. By the late 1870s, his development was well known. He decided to experiment over a longer range and conducted brief conversations between Launceston and the Campbelltown railway station. It is claimed this was the first telephone conversation in Australia, but sadly the exact date of the experiment in 1877 is not recorded. In 1874, along with well-known astronomer Dr. William Valentine, he prepared the equipment for the team of US astronomers who observed the transit of Venus from Campbelltown. Biggs made the lenses for his telescope and ended up as a government astronomer. Biggs later built a working seismograph and is credited with regulating time on Launceston's public clocks. He worked at the Launceston Bank for Savings and invented a machine for testing coins to see if they were counterfeit or not. The first trunk call in the nation was made on December 1st, 1888, when the Hobart Post Office called the Bush Inn. New Norfolk made history again in 1939, when the first Tasmanian overseas call to London was made from its post office. The first telegraph ever sent in Tasmania was on the 8th of July 1857. Mr. E.S. Chapman, a journalist who went under the pseudonym Auger, who had connections with the newspaper Australian, was to send the message on behalf of the first ever editor and founder of the Mercury newspaper, Mr. Davies. Not bad, just 5 years after the cessation of convict transportation, and only 1 year after the granting of responsible government and the name change from Van Diemen's Land to Tasmania. Further on telephones, what is believed to be the first private telephone call from Hobart to England, a distance of 12,500 miles, was made by Frederick William Medhurst on Saturday, August 22nd, 1936. The call was made to his 90-year-old mother, Helen, who lived in Chobham, England. Frederick, who was born in 1867 and came to Australia in 1891, was also involved in another first, with colleagues from the Postmaster General's Department, William Philpott Hallam and Frank Prosser Bowden, in July 1901, during the visit to Hobart of the Duke and Duchess of York. A message was sent to the warship St George. This was the first ship-to-shore communication in the Southern Hemisphere. The message was sent from Blinking Billy Point, Sandy Bay. In 1895, the fiery-tempered Clement Lindley Rag was the first to set up weather observation posts in the Southern Hemisphere, one on the summit of Mount Wellington and the other at the Springs. It was a Tasmanian who started the Coles supermarket chain. George Coles worked at his father's store at Wilmot near Devonport. This was the original Coles store. He then went on to Melbourne to continue his enterprise there. Tasmania is home to the oldest continuous brewery with Cascade commencing in 1824. The Cascade Brewery story is so fascinating, I made a whole episode about it.
Hill's hoist was a Tasmanian invention, which of course is now Australia-wide.
On medical matters, the world's first ever infant respirator, better known as a humidicrib, was developed by Tasmania's Dr. William McIntyre in 1941 at Launceston.
Dr. William McIntyre had a distinguished military career as well. He was in the Boer War. In fact, he was in the 2nd Tasmanian Imperial Bushman, the same as my father, so they would have known each other. In the World War I, he got an MC, a military cross, for his medical help during World War I. Then after the war, he went fully with his medical profession. And it's during about 1942 that he developed the humid crib, which of course saved the lives of many, who knows, perhaps millions of babies. Dr. William McIntyre, he invented that whilst working for the hospital up in Launceston. But I've done some research on him. There's never been a real accreditation of his momentous work in this regard. As an interesting sideline, his wife, Margaret, was the first lady to sit in the upper house in the Tasmanian Parliament. Interesting enough, she got killed in a plane crash about 1948. But a very distinguished family, and I'm in the throes of exploring both their careers at the moment and hoping to give him more exposure for what he really needs. But looking at his background, I think he'd be the type of person that shunned accreditation or publicity. But I think he deserves it. Again, a Tasmanian invention.
Dr. Jim Frost developed an early baby monitor in the fight against sudden infant death syndrome, while it was Dr. William Pugh from Launceston who in 1847 performed the first operation in the Southern Hemisphere using ether as an anaesthetic. Tasmania was the first state in Australia to have compulsory massed chest x-rays to combat tuberculosis, besides screening programs for the detection of early cancers in the uterus. Let us not forget the Alexander technique, formulated by Wynyard-born Frederick Alexander. This technique has improved health using posture and is available worldwide. Moving to the scientific world, while not born in Tasmania, astronomer Grote Reber came to the state in the 1950s because of our unique location at high magnetic latitude in the Southern Hemisphere. He's been called the father of radio astronomy, and he was the first person to build a big dish antenna for the purpose of mapping the sky at radio frequencies. The museum just off the Richmond Road at Cambridge exhibits Reber's telescopes and is open to the public by appointment. My friend and photographer Dr. Jim Polfriman often conducts those tours, and Jim's PhD is about observations made with a radio telescope. We were the first colony to adopt a constitution in 1856, and that was drawn up by later-to-be Premier Thomas G. Gregson. We were the first state to proclaim its own flag in 1975. The first session of the Federal Council of Australia to promote federation was held in Tasmania in 1886. In 1837, Sir John Franklin passed Australia's first laws regarding cruelty to animals. The rising sun emblem that appears on the Army's slouch hat was first designed and used in Tasmania. It appeared on the Convict Transportation Cessation Medal in 1853, as with the early Australian coat of arms, which was also on the medallion. On military matters, we were the first state to organise an annual Boer War commemorative day in 2002. The oldest continuous military establishment in Australia is Anglesey Barracks, founded by Governor Lachlan Macquarie on the 9th of December 1811. Tasmania has the only memorial in the nation to the Maori Wars of the 1840s, and that's located at Anglesey Barracks, dedicated to the 99th Foot, who were stationed there. We were the first state in Australia to erect a memorial to World War I. The RSL Launceston is the oldest one in the nation. The highest decorated soldier in the British Empire is Colonel Harry Murray from World War I, and he was from Evandale. The sad distinction of the first Australian believed to be killed at Gallipoli was a Tasmanian, Harry Hodgman, and the last man to leave was a Tasmanian, Captain Charles Littler. The first reported Australian to be killed in World War II was a Tasmanian, Flying Officer John Tulloch Sadler from the northwest coast. General Sir John Gellibrand was the highest-ranking Tasmanian in World War I.
His humanity was for the ex-servicemen and their families. And he started what they called then the Remembrance Club, which developed into what we know now as Legacy. Legacy, of course, has gone Australian-wide and has had a profound effect upon not only the servicemen, but of course mainly their families. So there we have another Tasmanian innovation, if you like, which is Legacy.
The Victoria Cross Medal is the highest military honour.
The total number of Australians who won Victoria Crosses is 100. Now, we make up 2.5% of the population, but we make up 14% of VC recipients. The first two Australian-born Victoria Cross winners were Tasmanians. Mr. Misty, John Hutton Misty, and a fellow called Guy Wiley. They won their VC winners on the same day in South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War. So whereas they weren't the first Australian to be given a VC, they were beaten to it by a few days, the recipient, Magar, he wasn't born here, he was English. So the first two Australian-born Australians who won the VCs were Tasmanians.
Another Tasmanian soldier highly decorated from World War I was Louis Charles Bonacci, who had already made history in 1899 when, as a physicist, he was the first Australian to set foot on Antarctic ice. And on the matter of ice, it was Tasmanian Malcolm Wallhead who invented the igloo satellite, or apple hut, suitable to live in freezing conditions and now used extensively for accommodation in Antarctica. There is also a claim that the first ever non-government produced Antarctic magazine, focusing on business activities, was produced and edited by Malcolm and his wife Anthea. Named Icebreaker, it circulated from 1997 to 2012. Another Tasmanian innovation is from Brian Stafford with his patented wheelie bin handling system. That's an Australian first. The trolley is stopped about a foot before the bin handlebars, then tilted forward until the hooks on the trolley shafts are under the bin handlebars. By moving the trolley a little further, applying the brakes and pulling backwards, the trolley will load the bin, release the brake and away you go. We were the first to legalise casinos in 1968, while the year previously we were the first in Australia to abolish 6 o'clock closing. Back in 1895, Tasmania attracted a resident who helped stave off the state bankruptcy. In that year, George Adams arrived after having his lottery enterprises banned in the other mainland colonies. Our Premier, Edward Braddon, invited him to set up his business in Tasmania, thus becoming the first state in federated Australia to legalise lotteries. Adams operated his nationwide business from Hobart, and by the 1930s the government's share amounted to almost 50% of its revenue. Sadly, in 1954, without reference to the then Premier Cosgrove, his fellow Labor Victorian colleagues enticed the enterprise to that state. By then, the amiable and kind Adams had long since died. The Theatre Royal in Campbell Street is the oldest continually operating theatre in Australia, 1837. Incidentally, it was Arthur Mace, a Tasmanian born and from Buckland, who was with Howard Carter when he rediscovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923 and was there when he entered it for the first time. Tasmania was the first to have a trout hatchery at the salmon ponds and the first in Australia to introduce daylight saving. Tasmania has the oldest golf club, Bothwell, 1839, and was the first to play lawn bowls, 1846. Hobart was the first royal tennis club in Australia, and the Royal Society of Tasmania was the first royal society to be established in the world outside the United Kingdom. Woodchopping had its beginnings in Ulverston in 1870. Interestingly, the name given to the Australian wild horse, Brumby, was named after James Brumby. He has a memorial in the Christchurch graveyard at Longford, dated 1838. Tasmania is the home of the longest continuously operating newspaper in the nation, The Examiner, 1842, and Andrew Bent published the first literary work in 1818. Evan Henry Thomas from Launceston was the first in Australia to publish a drama in 1835, and home to the nation's first novelist, Henry Savary. It was a Tasmanian, Edward Abbott, who published the nation's first cookbook, the English and Australian Cookery Book, in 1864. The oldest bookshop operating in Australia was Birchall's in Launceston, 1844, until it ceased in 2015. Launceston was the first city to open a mall in 1974, and it was the first city to have an urban land use plan, 1835, and was also the first city in the Southern Hemisphere to be illuminated by hydropower. It also elected the first female mayor, Dorothy Edwards, in 1956. Mrs. Isabella Mead was the first woman appointed as a director of an Australian museum when she became director of the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. Launceston also has the first underground sewage system in Australia. In 1984, Seasol was the first to commercialise liquid organic seaweed fertiliser in the country. In Hobart, the earliest of libraries in Australia was the Wesleyan Library in 1825. Hobart was the first city to have parking meters in Australia in 1955. And regarding transport, Hobart was the only city in Australia to have double-decker trams and the first complete electrified tram system in the Southern Hemisphere, September of 1893. The oldest continuous Jewish synagogue exists in Hobart, 1843, with Launceston having the second oldest, 1846. The oldest continuous Catholic church in Australia is St John's at Richmond, 1835, and the old Wesleyan church in New Norfolk is possibly the oldest Methodist church in the country, 1837. The oldest Seventh-day Adventist church building is at Collinsvale. More on Methodism. When it was forbidden for women to preach, it's believed the first occasion in Australia for a woman to do so was at Kingston, then referred to as Browns River. Harriet Pullen from Kent in England had settled in Van Diemen's Land and had a desire to bring Christian influence to the convict colony. In the late 1830s, she conducted services in her home. Many attending said it was a curiosity to see a woman preach, but by all accounts she was well received and her efforts were well rewarded with converts. Near New Norfolk, the claimant to be the first white woman in Australia, Betty King, setting foot in Australia January 26, 1788, is buried at Back River, just outside New Norfolk. The Richmond Bridge is the oldest in Australia, 1825, and the convict-built Tunbridge Bridge spanning the Blackman River is the oldest single-span bridge in Australia, 1848. In 1868, Tasmania became the first colony to have a compulsory state education system to be administered by a local schools board, and the first to establish area schools and matriculation colleges. The Launceston Grammar School and Hutchins in the south opened in 1846, becoming the oldest continuously functioning private school in Australia. Some Tasmanians of note were Enid Lyons, the first woman in federal parliament, composer Peter Sculthorpe, cricketer Max Walker, woodchopper David Foster, Mary Donaldson, Princess of Denmark, and numerous Australian rules footballers, including up there Roy Kazali. Then of course there was Errol Flynn. Defender snail pellets were developed by Tasmanian Les Vaughan. Andrew Inglis Clark from Hobart has been dubbed the father of federation and is the instigator of the Hare-Clark system, which is peculiar to Tasmania, for voting in the lower house, introduced in 1909. The Robson rotation, whereby through rotation each candidate gets a share of the position at the top of the ballot paper, that's unique to Tasmania. Introduced by Neil Robson, MHA, it was the brainchild of Dr. George Howitt. Joseph Cocker of Barrington invented a potato digger, which was patented to an American manufacturer and marketed successfully in the 1890s to the USA. Tasmania was the first state to be declared free of hydatits in 1996, and the first time an authentic Scottish tartan was produced in Australia was at the Waverley Woolen Mills at Launceston. The Tasmanian government was the first state government to be on the internet, 1996. Waxed paper for the storage of apples for export was another Tasmanian innovation. The Wright family of Glenorchy, in competition with the Shoebridge family, had to find a way to export their apples to England without half of them arriving rotten. Wrapping each apple individually proved to be successful, as wax paper is waterproof. A way of preserving reduced fat cream was invented by Miss I.M. Lowther. The development was eventually sold by Nestles in a tin. The method was successful in keeping cream fresh without preservatives for as long as 6 months. Miss Lowther worked as a tester and grader at a Devonport butter factory. Finally, the last Englishman to be gibbeted, and if you don't know what that is, it's to be executed and then the corpse is hung and displayed inside an iron cage as some sort of deterrent. Well, the last man to suffer this punishment was bushranger John Mackay, 5th of May 1837. His body was on display just north of Perth, about 450 yards off the main road, and that place is now called Gibbet Hill. If you ever feel like Tasmania's small or you just need a pick-me-up, check out the full paper at regwatson.com. Reg Watson's a writer and 6th-generation Tasmanian Australian. Like so many Tasmanian historians, he's helped me immensely in producing Forgotten Tasmania. For over 200 years, we've been pondering the question, what is Tasmanian culture? Well, there's over 500,000 people living here now, and I think that's about 500,000 answers to that question. We are Tasmanian. These are our stories. This is Forgotten Tasmania.